down here, you're probably asleep, right? So if I follow it across a typical day that is sort of following the rules of, let's say, a circadian rhythm, most people are typically asleep at around 4 a.m. They typically are going to get up with the sunshine. They become more awake. Most of you are comfortable with that concept of the afternoon, drowsy nap time period. And then you become more awake where your peak alertness is really being reached around 6 p.m. And then most people will be ready to go to bed after 9 o'clock. And so the cycle repeats. Okay? So these areas that are highlighted in here in red are what the literature calls forbidden zones. And these are a period where your body is actively making it difficult for you to fall asleep. I do want to highlight that, different pieces of literature will actually set the gates at slightly different places on the timeline, because it's not a really hard rule for all people. It's more of where these gates fall are generally between 8, 9 a.m., 11, 12. There's some individual variation, if you will, right? But in general, it is easier for people to fall asleep after 9 p.m. So attempting to go to bed at 6 p.m., for example, is typically difficult, right? It is also generally difficult to fall asleep at 8 a.m., which, you can sort of see as a highlight, somebody coming off of shift and arriving at home at 8 a.m. may not be able to fall asleep for the next 8 hours, right? And these FZ, the forbidden zones, therefore, in the context of shift, can dramatically affect the total sleep time that you have, right? Both in terms of quantity and quality. And also, the flip of that, from a work perspective, these zones are also areas of peak alertness. So when you're trying to schedule probably your most demanding tasks or your most complex tasks, these are ideal times for that. I think the old, strategy of teaching math first thing in the morning to students, I think it partly is because of this sort of forbidden zone alertness time. Now, the other sort of contrasting point to that are what's called peak fatigue zone. So not only are there times in the day where it's difficult to fall asleep, there are times of the day where it's easier to fall asleep. And these ones are actually categorized by, let's say, intensity. So if I think about that concept of sleep drive, my peak fatigue zone 1 is where my drive to fall asleep of the 3 fatigue zones is the highest. And so it's pretty easy to fall asleep between about 4 and 6 a.m. in the morning. I always find, don't you find you wake up at, 4 or 5? Anyway, tangent. The second one is sort of just before that, so around 2 to 4 a.m. in the morning. And again, these are hard lines, but general zones. And then the third one falls in that time in the afternoon that I think most of us are familiar with, where you get a little bit drowsy. You can fall asleep at that point. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about sleep deprivation then. In terms of sleep deprivation, we can talk about it in kind of 2 senses. We can talk about it in terms of acute deprivation, where you've essentially lost an entire night of sleep, right? And for an acute deprivation, it's pretty reliable, I guess, in terms of the literature. If you track how many hours awake people are, that really performance starts to decline after 16 hours. 16 hours is like a hard line where, I don't know, 100% of people are going to have a decline in performance, okay? Outside of that line, you need to be aware that other things can move that line up. So, for example, if you're doing a job that has a high physical workload to it, right? If you think about a firefighter fighting fire all day, they may not, their performance is probably dropping before 16 hours. Other things to consider, and this is not a comprehensive list of considerations, but what was their prior sleep before? So did they have were they in a fully recovered state of sleep before they went into the 16-hour loss, or had they had truncated sleep leading up to that? And then it becomes trickier. And also, of course, personal factors can accelerate that, right? What is the age of the individual? What medication are they on? Lots of personal factors. But in context of the workplace, acute sleep loss is not really the most common type of problem. And so just to make you aware of it, the one we probably are more going to focus on is partial sleep deprivation. So first point there, it's the most common type. And this is where you have basically truncated sleep. So you have some sleep lost over a period of nights. So you can imagine if I normally require 8 hours of sleep every night, and I've only been getting 6 hours of sleep for the last 4 nights, then I'm getting partial sleep loss, right? This last point here around quality of sleep, though, I want to highlight too, because we can talk about partial sleep loss in terms of quantity, right? Total hours. We can also talk about sleep loss in terms of quality. So you could have 8 hours or 10 hours of sleep, but if it's poor quality sleep, you are still not getting adequate sleep. And in that context, it particularly becomes important when we're talking about night shift, because a person who has truncated sleep during the night is getting better quality sleep than a person who's trying to sleep during the daytime, whether or not it's truncated, because of those forbidden zones, right? So your quality of sleep, if you're trying to sleep from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m., your quality of sleep is impacted. So that's also a partial sleep deficit. Okay, and I wanted to let you know, this is, I think, a really useful slide. There's a term we talk about in context of that, which is called sleep debt. And basically, bolded in red there is that message. For every hour of lost sleep, you actually need 2 hours of quality sleep to make up for it. And so if I'm sleeping only 6 hours a night for 3 nights in a row, and I need 8 hours, at the end of those 3 nights, I don't just need 6 hours more of sleep, I need 12 hours more of sleep, because I need extra, right? So something to help people when they're trying to plan for their recovery sleep when they know they've had a sleep lost. And the last point here, shift workers routinely carry a sleep debt that's accumulating over successive days into significant fatigue. And of course, we care about this because significant fatigue has implications for both our personal health, right, but also for our safety at work and outside of work. So just a couple little pieces of information around this in terms of risk. There have been a number of studies that have looked at partial sleep deprivation, where 5 hours a night, because I think 5 hours a night is a common chronic sleep deprivation. And what they show is that performance decreases kind of steadily for 2 days after, then it levels out for about 5 days, and then it gets really worse. Now, keep in mind, so performance dropping for 2 days and then leveling out doesn't mean that their performance at day 3 is the same as it was at day 1, right? It has dropped. So if their normal performance is 100%, that means that, you know, day 2, 3, 4, 5, they're at 80% normal performance. And I highlight that because they may be functional, but they're not optimum. And of course, performance is a strong indicator of health and safety, right? And I think people know this, right? Anybody that's doing 4-day shift work knows that the 4th day is typically the worst day because of that. But I also want to point out this last one here with the stars. The studies that are out there, they're research-based. They put people to bed and then they only let them sleep 5 hours, but it was nighttime sleep. So in terms of quality sleep, they were probably still getting quality sleep. And so if you were looking at a person who was doing daytime sleep and only getting 5 hours, their quality was probably worse. And I think that's reflected in this really excellent review study that's been by Follard and Tucker. where they summarized the literature around looking at accidents, and this represents 7 different studies that looked at injuries and accidents in different jobs and categorized them based on what shift day you were on. And so on the right-hand side here, you can see for people who were working morning and day shifts, there was, so one is no, the risk is compared to day 1, right? So day 1 was like the baseline. Risk still steadily increased by day 4, suggesting that even though the studies are saying performance has leveled out on day 4, you still have an increased risk. So there might be something else. But clearly, the people who were working night shift were having more dramatic increases in injury risk, and likely related to the poorer quality of sleep in their truncated sleep. Okay, so I just want to throw these points out here as well as something to pick up later on. When you are fatigued, the longer the task is that you're performing, the poorer your performance, which means, I mean, you can interpret in a couple different ways. If you're doing a task that only takes you about 2 minutes, you probably haven't lost performance over multiple days of the task, right? And so, I mean, we have to interpret some of this. The 24-hour schedule is not going to go away, right? So in context of the 24-hour schedule, how are we going to plan tasks? And so knowing that shorter tasks are typically performed at the same quality level when you're more fatigued, that's helpful. But the longer the task, the poorer your performance. So really anything beyond 15 minutes, you start to see performance decline. There's some variability in there, like motivation or, but for the most part, that's the standard. Also, the more complex the task, the poorer performance, which I think makes sense intuitively. So let's jump into shift scheduling now. So I can't represent all the different types of shift schedules that are out there. And so I just basically divided into the 3, I would say, most common. And I start with the traditional day for contrast. Okay, so here's our bar graph again. We've got roughly 2 days of work shown. And now you can kind of see, actually, if I jump to my peak fatigue zones, this is kind of nice, right? The person is mostly sleeping when they're most fatigued. They're probably getting up and driving to work while they are alert, right? They're hitting at least one of the peak alertness zones in terms of accomplishing their tasks at work. They're certainly alert for the commute home, and on a personal level, they have both time and alertness to spend on other non-work related tasks. So whether that's family, whether that's, I don't know, this time of year, raking the lawn, all your other non-work related obligations, right? And importantly, keep in mind that what's nice about this schedule too is that culturally, people work on this schedule. And so families are classically having meals at morning, lunch, and dinner. Parties are typically being planned for the evenings, especially on Friday and Saturday night. And so people working on this schedule will have an easier time meeting their social obligations without impacting their sleep. Okay, so then let's look at a couple of morning shifts. So here is, the upper one is shifts from 6 to 2 a.m. The lower one is shifts from 6 to 6 p.m. And let's first look at now, where do the fatigue zones come in? And I think the main fears for me when I look at this, first and foremost, are commuting, right? They're classically now getting to work and leaving work, especially this shift here, when they are quite fatigued, which is risky. But the other classic thing that you'll see with morning shift now, if you look at the time period for when they have opportunity to sleep, right? Obviously in this 12-hour shift, opportunity to sleep is dramatically truncated. Also, at least half of that opportunity is in a high alert zone, right? So it's actually going to be quite difficult for them to fall asleep when they end shift. And then if I go back here, because they have to get up early, they're also going to suffer with a truncated shift or sleep time. So of the total time that they have available to sleep, so even if I look at the 6 to 2, they had, you know, from 3, let's say, till, I don't know, whenever they got up in the morning, let's say 4 or 5, to sleep. But because they're probably doing family stuff here, and then they have to get up early to commute to work to get in for 6, they're probably not getting 8 hours sleep. They're getting a truncated sleep. So morning shift classically challenges are going to be total sleep time, but at least when they're getting sleep, it will probably be quality sleep, sort of. And also, I would highlight around alertness zones for the workplace, they're probably pretty alert, and so are able to effectively accomplish tasks, at least in the early shifts. Night shift now, so I put up a couple of different concepts, either a 10 to 6 a.m. night shift at the top, or a 6 to 6 night shift on the bottom. And if we look at the same kind of thing now, we're getting absolutely problems around fatigue for the drive home, right? And, you know, put on top of that the time of day that it's happening, darkness, that's a real problem. But if we also look now, what are the opportunities for sleep? They have, depending on your shift, on here they've got 12 hours of opportunity for sleep, but significant portions of that sleep is going to fall over these forbidden zones, and so it's going to be poor quality of sleep. For the longer 12-hour shift, we've got both a compromised quality and a truncated quantity of total sleep. And keep in mind, again, just in terms of social obligations now, you know, if you're getting home, let's say, just before 8 a.m., it's going to be hard to sleep. You may want to have breakfast with the family, do your other home-related stuff, right? So, actually, early on time, I'm like unprepared, but that's okay. Leave quite time for questions. I lastly wanted to bring in some concepts around this work-life balance piece. And part of it is absolutely, you know, that commute time. I put together these slides in thinking, first and foremost, from the worker's point of view, what should you be thinking about to best protect yourself, right? But also from the workplace point of view, workplaces, especially that are on a 24-hour schedule, need to be proactively developing a fatigue management strategy, right? And I don't think it's acceptable anymore from the workplace's point of view, really, or from the workers, to not be taking in commute time as part of that fatigue management. Realistically, many people commute hours a day, right? Or especially for jobs where you're traveling to get to the job or traveling back, you may be commuting even longer around those shift weeks. And everybody has heard of a terrible story of somebody coming home and dying in a car crash because they fell asleep at the wheel, right? So we need to be considering our travel time, how we're traveling, when is the travel time occurring in context of those fatigue peak zones in particular, and also how long. Because when I talked about that concept of the longer the task, the poorer the performance, driving in our mind is a pretty easy task. So it's a simple task, and so we do it for a few minutes, and then we zone out and we fall asleep. And I grabbed a couple of slides from a different talk I did to highlight this. So driving in Canada, 20% of drivers have fallen asleep or nodded off while driving in the past year. So common, and I think this speaks to, you know, how many people haven't picked up a newspaper in the last, 6 months and read some story about the poor quality of sleep that the Canadians, Americans, and the world is getting, right? And I think it's reflected in this driving and fatalities associated with it. 33% have been driving for less than an hour when they fell asleep at the wheel. So if you're doing even an hour commute, it's high risk. 30% have been happening between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m., which makes sense because if you look at the studies that map out fatalities across a 24-hour period, they fall in those fatigue zones. That's how they identified those peak fatigue zones, was really around fatalities, right? And they're 1, 2, 3 by how many people get in accidents around those 3 times. 61% of drivers rated drowsy driving as a very or extremely serious problem. So this lecture is not about what we can do to prevent this, but this lecture is certainly about awareness that this is happening, and you need to be thinking about what you as an individual can do if you have to commute, but also as a workplace, what should we be doing or promoting with our workers to prevent it, right? I also really like this, I went to a fatigue conference last year, and this is one of the conversations that was brought up that really like surprised me and interested me. So basically, the DRAM law, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is the DRAM law is the law that states that if a business or a host, so if I'm hosting a party and I serve alcohol to a person who is obviously intoxicated, then that bar or that person is liable for the injuries sustained by a third party as a result of that intoxicated person, particularly getting in a car and driving away and getting in an accident, right? I don't know exactly what year that law came out, but there's been lots of conversation about it, and this is on the books. So the question is, and I've heard lots of sleep talks around how being sleep deprived is like being drunk, right? There's lots of papers that quote what kind of alcohol level you have with a certain level of sleep deprivation. So the question is the company actually liable if a person gets in their car after 4 consecutive night shifts and crashes into a rock face? Is the company liable because they knew with a reasonable expectation that the person was incapable of driving? This is not a law that is on the books, but this is certainly a conversation that people are having, and some countries like Australia have been a lot more proactive in preventing their workers from commuting, particularly after a shift, for long hours when they know the business is located at a place where, you know, a large percentage of their workers have to commute an hour or more to get there, right? So I put that up there because it made me really think, so hopefully it makes all of you really think, but also I put it up there because if you needed incentive for developing a fatigue management strategy, I think that's the incentive, right? Okay. So I also wanted to highlight a few other things around that concept. So the first is, you know, what's happening on non-work time. And I want you to be aware, and people who are working shifts probably already know this, but when workers get off shift that are night shift or even morning shift or afternoon shift, they almost always revert back to your standard, I sleep at night and I am awake during the day. It typically takes a couple of days for them to do that because let's say they get off of 4 days of shift and they're exhausted, and so a lot of people will still though push through to stay up in time with the family for that day and then go to bed and sleep extra long that night, and then, you know, the next day get back on the day-night schedule, right? So I think part of the reason why that's important to know is because when you're developing a shift schedule now, how many days off does a person need to get that opportunity for recovery sleep? If I said to you, the rule of thumb is for every hour that you don't have enough sleep, you need 2 hours of recovery sleep. And if a standard shift is 4 shifts, and over that time you've lost how much sleep? What's your sleep debt, if you did a calculation? And then work it in, okay, now you have 4 days off. Do you have enough time in those 4 days off to actually achieve that recovery sleep and still do life, right? And again, I want to emphasize that because if you don't get that recovery sleep, so we've just finished shift block 1, now we're going into shift block 2, already fatigued or already sleep deprived. And I think that's the way a lot of us are functioning, right? Is we're not getting our recovery sleep. So, the other thing, this is obvious, and yet I don't think we talk about it enough, and I think we need to talk about it. When you're not at work, there are lots of things to do. You cannot plan a schedule or plan a fatigue management strategy without considering the other obligations that people have for life, right? We can talk about work-life balance, but it's important for healthy and happy humans to actually have time for leisure. Leisure time. Caleb's like, what is leisure time? No one knows. But we need that. Sorry, Caleb has 4 children. In addition, you know, people are generally social creatures, and we generally need to interact with other humans. And so there, and tied to that, to have a happy network, we have social obligations, right? There needs to be time to do that. Certainly there needs to be time for family, and in today's reality, that might even, you know, when we talk about people who have elderly family that may need care, as well as young people that may need care, family time can be very demanding, but not even just the obligation piece around that. People want to have meals with their family. And when you're looking at your schedule, you should be looking at it with the sense that your workers are probably having meals with their family. They are probably not sleeping. Similarly, there are all kinds of planned events and activities that our life has, and there needs to be time to do those. And of course, those other obligations, you can tell what I did last weekend, because I was thinking, breaking the law. So my summary slide is pretty short, and it certainly doesn't capture everything around sleep, but to highlight some of the points, right? Obligation for mitigating fatigue in a safe way falls on both the workplace and the worker. You never want to come away from a talk being like, you, the workplace, aren't doing enough, you, the worker, aren't doing enough. I think there's obligation on both sides. And so I hope you don't see the summary slide as being more obligatory for the worker. But I do think it's important for workers and their families to look at their own schedules and their own sleep patterns and identify peak risks. And I purposely put the word in their families because I think there's a guilt and a give and pull there, right? Where the family members may not understand the consequences that the worker is experiencing from a shift that doesn't fit with their normal traditional schedule. And so there needs to be both an education but also communication around need and around safety. Because I think if you explain to your family that you could get hurt if you don't get enough sleep, then they become part of the team in helping you get the right amount of sleep, quality and quantity, right? And so I would encourage you to almost map out in your own way. What's the shift that you do? What's the shift that your, you know, I don't know, even your kids do? Look at your activity, your weekly demands across that shift. Look at when you're most fatigued and when your sleep opportunities are, and literally strategize to maximize your sleep, right? And reminding yourself to keep in mind, in fact, if you're really keen, you can do a sleep recovery estimation and plan that in on top of your own schedule. The third point is we need to work towards a culture where workers report personal fatigue in their workplace, but also where they feel psychologically safe to do so. Particularly, you know, people have weddings that they go to or family events where they really didn't get enough sleep. Maybe they normally get enough sleep, but that week they didn't get enough sleep. It should be perfectly fine for you to go into the workplace and say, especially in a high-risk job, say, I'm not my normal self today, this shift week. I either need some time to go sleep, or I need to have my job tasks modified for this shift because I'm not safe. And they need to be able to do that without fear of retribution, right? And that's a safety culture around sleep and sleep reporting. And then my last point here, if you're at a workplace that hasn't started developing their fatigue management strategy, they really need to do that, right? Workplaces need to look at their work schedules. They need to look at their schedules in the context of reality. I tried to think how to say that right, but with what I've just showed you, people have lives, people have obligations, people want to eat meals with their family. In that reality, how do we safely either create a schedule that works or build in mitigating strategies to manage fatigue? For example, a controlled nap. I love the concept of a controlled nap. You can plan that into your schedule, right? If that, anyways, but to do that, you need to look at what's happening and then come together with a strategy that works. So I would like to acknowledge Dr. Karakesh and Courtney Lessel. The slides were all Courtney, great job. And if you're interested and want to know more information around this, we're hoping to have the guidebook out by the end of the year. Say that. I also wanted to let people know CROSH has a number of workshops that they're offering this year, but one of the workshops is around sleep. So if you would like to have more of an individualized conversation around sleep and shift at your workplace, you can contact us and we can schedule that. And lastly, CROSH is also involved in developing what we're calling knowledge transfer toolkits. We're offering these toolkits to you for free if you would like to pilot one of them. And again, this work is led by Dr. Mallory Leduc, but I would highlight that one of the toolkits that's coming out is also on fatigue, so different opportunities around sleep if you are more interested. And lastly, here's our contact information, and I'll open the floor for questions.
Thank you. First, any questions from the audience? The live audience?
I just explained it all, right? Fantastic.
I do have a question.
Go for it.
Sure.
I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm so sorry. So, again, we talk about mitigation strategies.
Yeah.
And primarily discuss behavioral type approaches and how to handle individual approaches in a variety of ways. Is there other mechanistic mitigation strategies that you would maybe suggest to try to reduce fatigue if you have to do that shift or to have to make that long drive? And kind of tips that would help you feel less fatigue, at least for a short amount of time until you can either get home or you can finish your work.
Yes, and the reason why I guess I didn't go down that route today was in part because for 45 minutes, I could almost do a mini series of talks around sleep, right? So mitigation strategies, absolutely. Lots of different ones, honestly. There's some real basic things like commuting together. A workplace could have opportunity and or have an enforced nap before you left to commute home, particularly given certain work situations. There's certainly a number of technologies that are available to monitor your fatigue level while you're driving, for driving in particular, and the challenges around most of those strategies, or like the technological strategies, if you will, it's not that they may or may not work. The problem is that most of the companies that have developed them have self-tested, and they haven't been validated by an external source. And so lacking that information, it's difficult to recommend one, right? Having said that, if I really believed that technology, X was fantastic and you should wear it on the commute home to alert you when you're getting fatigued, that can't be the only strategy you put in place. One, because you're not really preventing the problem. You're like hitting it while it's happening, which still has a lot of risk, right? If I'm driving and I'm nodding off and then I get an alert that's like, whoop, whoop, ah, right? That's not ideal necessarily, right? Also, you have to respond to that alert. If you get the alert and you're like, oh yeah, I'm awake, turn off the music. So it's not, they're helpful, and I don't want to throw them in the garbage pail, but they're not on their own. I don't think they're the savior for this problem, I guess what I'm saying. And then there's other little things, people talk about eating an apple because they'll wake you up for a few minutes. Even having somebody commute with you so that they talk to you and make sure you're awake. These are so contextual, right? Pick a job, pick a specific application, but there are absolutely solutions, including really even messing with light. You've seen the new glasses that have blue light to help you wake up while you're driving, and at the same time programming your devices to reduce the blue light so they don't keep you up when you're trying to fall asleep. Yeah, endless.
So there's an online question that was really similar to what Dominic just asked. So I think you answered part of it, but then is there any specific examples of employers that have developed these fatigue management strategies?
Yes, probably the group that does it the best, I'm going to say, is aviation, okay. Which probably isn't a surprise. When you're developing your fatigue strategy, partly you're looking at what is the risk involved, and having someone crash an airplane with 400 people in it is a very high risk, traumatic outcomes. And so I think they're really leading the way in terms of fatigue management tactics. Part of it is using big data to track what your workers are doing. Part of it is tracking near misses as well as actual accidents so that you can see when your peak incidents are likely to happen in your own workplace. Part of it is, judging the error rate, but making the hard decisions sometimes, because there is absolutely a pull around shift. People like 4-day, 12-hour shifts because it gives them opportunity for other things. So, sometimes that, but I'm getting off track. Other than aviation, shipping has put a lot of energy into it. I would say rail is trying to get there because they're suffering from some pretty serious challenges around fatigue in their workforce. And developmentally, I would also say that Australia mining is leading the research in fatigue management.
There's also a comment saying that in BC, they have a few employers that are developing fatigue risk management systems based around Dr. Drew Dawson's model. So that's another thing that people might want to be aware of.
Okay.
Another question, is there any legal legislation in terms of sleep and fatigue in Ontario or that you're aware of, or in other parts?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. I know there are a number of stories that people tell anecdotally that are negative, that are highlighting the need, I think, for regulation. So, for example, in an emergency situation, when you have to ask your workers to stay to manage something like a fire, I don't think there is any obligation afterwards, at least in Ontario, where you then have to make sure that those people get home safely after the fact. Caleb, Mal, you guys were at the fatigue conference. Is there anything that you can think of in terms of legislation?
I think there were a few examples given in around extreme cases, like you had said, not of course regular operations and duties, but where someone's had to work a double or a triple or something out of the ordinary, and then held responsible for placing them at that risk of danger. I think from our conversations that British Columbia might have some legislation on that.
There is a comment saying that in BC they do have legislation.
Yeah. Courtney, did you see
I
it?
think I haven't seen specific legislation, but they were talking about in Quebec there was nurses staging walkouts not long ago trying to get
I did hear
legislation
about that. Yeah.
about having to
Having their, because they're being forced to work back-to-back schedules and it's not safe. Yeah.
But I think it's more on specific, like you can't work over 48 hours a week, and that sort of seems like or whatever the hour, like it's more an hour limit rather than like having specifically.
I think a lot of them are industry specific too, or company regulations, right?
Yeah. Which is, I mean, provincial legislation guiding that would sort of force it, right?
I think we have time for maybe just 2 more questions. I know we have a lot more, so if you don't have your question answered, you can either email croschtech@laurentian.ca or at Dorman, and I'm sure Sandra will be happy to answer your question at laurentian.ca. Sorry.
I will, but I won't be fast.
One other question here. So, what are some strategies that CROSH is adopting to communicate the importance of sleep at the workplace with responsible employers and other OHS or work safe associations in Canada? And then a comment saying that there are other factors too, which are also socioeconomic conditions.
What are the strategies that CROSH is taking? I mean, I guess from a step back, our mandate is to conduct research with workplace parties. And so we have certainly tried to engage workplaces around different technologies to validate them in the workplace. I think one of the reasons why we started the guidebook was really to try and provide information, because we've been asked a lot to give more practical solutions just based on what is in the literature now. And there is a lot in the literature that I think can guide and inform us. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do. But also the reason why, those fatigue modules were planned for the toolkits and the workshops was, again, to try and provide up-to-date material based on the most current literature to workplaces that wanted to access it.
Right.
So I say that's our primary strategy.
And then, so last question before we have to end it. Do you have any recommendations for workers who work 24-hour shifts? Or have you found anything that could be helpful? Or
Recommendations for the worker
for the worker themselves? I mean, you did talk about some fatigue management
That's a
strategies.
little bit contextual, because that's something that is really going to have, I would say, health impacts in the long term as well as the short term. And certainly I would not want that person to get in a car afterwards. I think, as the driver. But I also probably, from an overall health perspective, they're going to be challenged around feeding patterns and not gaining weight, as well as trying to catch up on that recovery sleep and still maintaining a life. So, not really great. To prioritize, I guess, your recovery sleep and prioritize self-care. There's a good word, especially nutrition. I'm a nutritionist at heart.
All right, just for the sake of time, I think we'll end it there. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And thanks, everyone, for being here today as well.